The morning mist hung low over Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at her bedroom window watching the grounds come alive with activity. Staff members moved with quiet efficiency across the manicured lawns, their faces somber and purposeful. Today was different from any other day in her royal life. The weight of loss pressed heavily on her shoulders as she prepared for what would be one of the most challenging days the royal family had faced in recent years. Prince William emerged from their private bathroom, his usually confident stride showing signs of the emotional burden he carried. His jaw was set in determination, but Catherine could see the vulnerability in his eyes that he tried so hard to hide from the world. They had been through many public appearances together, but this farewell would test their strength in ways they had never experienced before. The news had arrived 3 days earlier during what should have been a peaceful family breakfast with their children. George had been excitedly telling them about his upcoming school project when William's private secretary entered with a grave expression. The message was brief but devastating. A beloved member of their extended royal family had passed away. Unexpectedly, someone who had been a guiding light and source of wisdom for both William and Catherine throughout their marriage. Lady Margaret Thornton had been more than just a distant royal relative. She had served as an unofficial mentor to Catherine during her early days as a duchess, helping her navigate the complex world of royal protocol while maintaining her authentic self. Margaret had been present at their wedding, had bounced their children on her knee during private family gatherings, and had offered sage advice during some of their most challenging moments in the public eye. The woman had lived through decades of royal history, having served various members of the family with distinction and grace. Her stories of past royal events had fascinated William since childhood, and she had become one of the few people who could make him laugh genuinely during formal occasions. Her sudden passing at the age of 89 had left a void that neither William nor Catherine had anticipated would feel so profound. As Catherine moved away from the window, she caught sight of herself in the ornate mirror that had witnessed countless royal preparations. Her reflection showed a woman who had grown into her role with elegance and purpose, but today, the weight of responsibility felt heavier than usual. She would need to be strong not just for herself, but for William, for their children, and for the thousands of people who would be watching their every gesture during the farewell ceremony. The black dress she had chosen hung perfectly, its simple elegance reflecting the respect and dignity that Lady Margaret had always embodied. Catherine had learned from her mentor that true grace came not from elaborate displays, but from genuine emotion expressed with restraint and dignity. As she fastened her grandmother's pearl necklace, she could almost hear Margaret's gentle voice, reminding her that authenticity was the most powerful tool any royal could possess. William joined her at the dressing table, his formal military uniform immaculate despite the early hour. They had discussed whether he should wear his ceremonial dress or something more subdued, ultimately deciding that Margaret would have wanted them to honor tradition while staying true to their hearts. The woman had always appreciated the balance between duty and personal expression that defined their approach to royal life. Their children had been told about Lady Margaret's passing in gentle terms appropriate for their ages. George, now old enough to understand loss, had asked thoughtful questions about death and remembrance. Charlotte had wanted to draw a picture for Auntie Margaret, not fully grasping that her colorful artwork could no longer bring the elderly woman joy. Louis, still very young, had sensed the sadness in the house without fully understanding its source. The decision about whether the children should attend the farewell ceremony had sparked long discussions between William and Catherine. Margaret had adored the children and had specifically mentioned in her final wishes that she hoped they would remember her with happiness rather than sadness. After consulting with child psychologists and considering their own family values, they had decided that George would attend the ceremony while Charlotte and Louis would participate in a private family remembrance at home. Catherine's phone buzzed, with messages from her sister Pippa, offering support and sharing her own fond memories of Lady Margaret. The Middleton family had grown close to the elderly woman over the years, appreciating her warmth and wisdom. Catherine's parents had sent flowers with a personal note, remembering how Margaret had made them feel welcome during their first formal, royal events. The palace staff moved through their morning routines with extra care and attention to detail. Everyone understood that this day would be scrutinized by the media and the public, but more importantly, it was a genuine farewell to someone who had touched many lives within the royal household. Housekeepers who had worked alongside Margaret for decades were struggling with their own grief while maintaining the professional standards she had helped establish. William's private secretary arrived with the final schedule for the day, including details about the media arrangements and the guest list for the private reception following the ceremony. Foreign dignitaries, longtime friends of the royal family, and individuals whose lives had been touched by Margaret's charitable work would gather to celebrate a life well lived. As they prepared for breakfast with George before departing for the ceremony, Catherine reflected on the lessons Lady Margaret had taught her about handling public grief. The woman had shared stories of other royal farewells, emphasizing that showing genuine emotion was not a sign of weakness, but a demonstration of the humanity that connected the royal family to their subjects. The breakfast conversation was gentle and focused on helping George understand his role in the day's events. William explained how people would be watching to see how their family honored Lady Margaret's memory, while Catherine reminded their son that feeling sad was natural and acceptable. They wanted him to witness how love and respect could be expressed, even in the midst of loss. Standing together in their private sitting room before leaving for the ceremony, William and Catherine shared a moment of quiet connection. They had faced many challenges together, but this farewell would require them to balance their private grief with their public responsibilities in ways that honored both their personal feelings and their royal duties. The day ahead would test their strength, but they would face it together, just as Lady Margaret had always encouraged them to do. The journey to Westminster Abbey felt longer than usual, despite the familiar route through London's historic streets. Catherine sat beside William in their official car, watching the city pass by while mentally preparing for the emotional challenges ahead. The morning sun filtered through the bulletproof windows, casting gentle shadows across their formal attire as they maintained the composed silence that had become their coping mechanism during difficult public appearances. George sat opposite them, his young face serious but curious, as he observed the increased security presence and the growing crowds lining their route. William had spent time explaining to their eldest son how today would be different from other royal events they had attended together. This wasn't a celebration or a ceremonial duty, but a genuine farewell to someone who had been family in every way that mattered. The crowds gathered along the streets showed a different energy than usual. Instead of the excited waves and cheerful calls that typically greeted royal appearances, people stood quietly with respectful expressions. Many held small bouquets of flowers or held up photographs of Lady Margaret from her decades of public service. Catherine noticed how some older women in the crowd had tears in their eyes, clearly remembering their own encounters with the beloved royal figure. Lady Margaret's influence extended far beyond the palace walls. During her 70 years of royal service, she had quietly championed numerous charitable causes, particularly those supporting elderly care and children's education. Her gentle approach to public engagement had earned her genuine affection from people across all social backgrounds. Today's farewell would honor not just her service to the royal family, but her broader impact on British society. William's hands remained steady, but Catherine could see the slight tension in his shoulders that indicated his internal struggle with the day's emotional demands. They had talked late into the night about how to balance their grief with their duty to provide comfort and stability to others who were also mourning. Lady Margaret had often reminded them that royal leadership sometimes meant carrying others' pain while managing their own. The security briefing had been thorough but sensitive, The palace staff understood that this event required a different approach than typical royal occasions. Media access would be limited to respect the family's privacy, but the ceremony would be broadcast to allow the many people who loved Lady Margaret to participate in saying goodbye. The balance between public interest and private grief had been carefully negotiated. As their car approached Westminster Abbey, Catherine could see the distinguished guests already beginning to arrive. Former prime ministers, foreign ambassadors, and representatives from the charitable organizations Lady Margaret had supported over the decades were gathering to pay their respects. The guest list read like a history of British public life, reflecting the woman's remarkable ability to build meaningful relationships across all sectors of society. The Archbishop of Canterbury had worked closely with the family to create a ceremony that honored Lady Margaret's deep faith while celebrating her joyful approach to life. She had been known for her infectious laugh and her ability to find humor even in the most formal situations. The service would include readings from her favorite biblical passages as well as musical selections that had special meaning to her and the royal family. Prince George's presence at the ceremony had been carefully considered. Child psychologists had advised that witnessing how his parents handled loss and grief could provide him with valuable emotional tools for his own future challenges. Lady Margaret had been particularly fond of George, often telling him stories about the history of the monarchy and teaching him about the responsibilities that would one day be his. Catherine's mind wandered to the private conversations she had shared with Lady Margaret over the years. The elderly woman had become a trusted confidant during Catherine's adjustment to royal life, offering practical advice about everything from managing public scrutiny to maintaining family relationships under constant observation. Her wisdom had been invaluable during some of Catherine's most challenging moments as a new royal. The approach to Westminster Abbey revealed the full scope of the day's significance. Honor guards stood at attention while palace staff coordinated the complex logistics of hosting such a distinguished gathering. The abbey itself seemed to hold extra solemnity, its ancient stones bearing witness to centuries of royal ceremonies, celebrations, and farewells. William helped George from the car with gentle encouragement, reminding his son about the behavior expectations while reassuring him that feeling emotional was perfectly acceptable. Catherine smoothed George's formal attire while mentally rehearsing her own role in the ceremony. She would need to support William while managing her own grief, all under the watchful eyes of both invited guests and the global media. The receiving line outside the Abbey provided an opportunity for William and Catherine to greet the other mourners personally. Foreign dignitaries who had worked with Lady Margaret on international charitable initiatives shared brief condolences. Longtime friends of the royal family offered embraces and shared memories. Each interaction required the couple to balance genuine emotion with royal protocol. Catherine noticed how William's demeanor shifted slightly as they moved through the formal greetings. His natural instinct to comfort others began to override his own grief, a characteristic that Lady Margaret had both admired and gently warned him about. She had often reminded him that leaders needed to process their own emotions in order to effectively support others through difficult times. The media presence, while respectful, was substantial. Photographers captured the family's arrival and their interactions with other mourners, but the coverage maintained the dignity appropriate for such a solemn occasion. Lady Margaret had enjoyed positive relationships with many journalists over the years, and they were honoring her memory by focusing on the celebration of her life rather than sensationalizing the royal family's grief. Inside the Abbey, the atmosphere was both majestic and intimate. Lady Margaret had specifically requested that the ceremony focus on gratitude for a life well lived rather than dwelling on the sadness of loss. The floral arrangements included her favorite flowers from the gardens at various royal residences, creating a connection between her public service and the private moments that had brought her joy. As they took their seats in the front pew, Catherine placed a gentle hand on George's shoulder, while William acknowledged the various guests with respectful nods. The family's positioning allowed them privacy for their personal grief while maintaining their visibility to those who had come to pay their respects. The careful balance between public and private mourning reflected the lessons Lady Margaret had taught them about authentic leadership during difficult times. The opening hymn filled Westminster Abbey with voices that seemed to reach every corner of the ancient building. Catherine felt the familiar comfort of shared music washing over her as hundreds of mourners joined together in harmony. Lady Margaret had chosen this particular hymn years ago, telling the family that she wanted her farewell to be filled with the same joy and hope that had guided her throughout her remarkable life. Prince George stood between his parents, his young voice tentatively, joining the singing while his eyes took in the grandeur of the ceremony. Catherine had helped him practice the hymns at home, explaining how music could be a way of expressing feelings that were sometimes too big for words. Now, seeing him participate with such dignity, she felt a surge of pride mixed with the ongoing sadness of the day. The Archbishop of Canterbury approached the pulpit with the measured steps of someone who understood the weight of the moment. His relationship with Lady Margaret had spanned decades, and his words would need to capture both her public service and the personal warmth that had endeared her to so many people. The silence in the Abbey was complete as he began to speak about a life dedicated to others. William listened intently to the Archbishop's opening remarks, recognizing stories and characteristics that had shaped his own understanding of royal duty. Lady Margaret had been present during many of the defining moments of his childhood and young adulthood, offering guidance that was both practical and deeply rooted in genuine care. Her influence on his development as a future king had been profound and lasting. The first reading came from Lady Margaret's great niece, a young woman whose composure and clear voice demonstrated the family's commitment to honoring their beloved relative with dignity. The passage from Ecclesiastes spoke of seasons and times, reminding everyone present that grief and celebration could coexist in the natural rhythm of life. Catherine found comfort in the familiar words while noting how they seemed particularly relevant to their current circumstances. Throughout the Abbey, the congregation represented an extraordinary cross-section of British society. Cabinet ministers sat near charity workers, foreign diplomats shared pews with palace staff, and members of the aristocracy listened alongside people whose lives had been directly touched by Lady Margaret's charitable work. The diversity of mourners reflected her ability to connect with people from all backgrounds with equal warmth and respect. Catherine's attention was drawn to an elderly woman in the third row who was quietly weeping while clutching a small photograph. Later, she would learn this was Mrs. Sarah Collins, whose grandson had received a scholarship to university through one of Lady Margaret's educational initiatives. The scholarship had changed the young man's life trajectory, and Mrs. Collins had maintained a correspondence with Lady Margaret for over 15 years. The musical selections continued to weave throughout the ceremony, each piece chosen for its personal significance to Lady Margaret and the royal family. A children's choir from one of her supported schools performed a piece that had been her particular favorite during school visits. Their pure voices created moments of transcendent beauty that seemed to lift the grief into something closer to celebration. Prince George whispered a quiet question to his father during one of the musical interludes, and William's gentle response demonstrated the careful balance they were maintaining between honoring the solemnity of the occasion and supporting their son's natural curiosity. Lady Margaret had always encouraged questions from children, believing that their innocent perspectives often revealed deeper truths about life and relationships. The second reading was delivered by Lord Hampton, Lady Margaret's oldest friend and contemporary, whose voice carried the weight of shared decades and countless memories. His selection from the Book of Wisdom spoke about souls being in the hands of God, a theme that resonated with Lady Margaret's deep faith and her peaceful approach to life's inevitable transitions. Catherine noticed how William's expressions softened during this reading, clearly finding comfort in its message. During the prayers that followed, Catherine found herself remembering specific conversations with Lady Margaret about faith, duty, and finding joy in service to others. The woman had possessed an remarkable ability to discuss serious topics while maintaining her characteristic warmth and gentle humor. Her advice had been invaluable during Catherine's early years as a royal, when every public appearance felt overwhelming and uncertain. The congregation's responses to the liturgical prayers created a sense of unity that transcended social boundaries and personal relationships with the deceased. Catholics and Anglicans, believers and skeptics, all participated in the ritual expressions of hope and remembrance that human beings have used for centuries to process loss and celebrate life. Lady Margaret would have appreciated how her farewell brought together such a diverse community. A representative from the Red Cross, an organization Lady Margaret had supported for over 40 years, delivered a brief tribute that highlighted her behind-the-scenes contributions to humanitarian work. Many people in the Abbey were learning for the first time about projects she had funded quietly, without seeking publicity or recognition. Her approach to charity had always emphasized results over credit, a philosophy that had enabled her to achieve remarkable impact while maintaining her privacy. William felt his emotions intensifying as the tributes continued, each speaker revealing new facets of Lady Margaret's character and influence. He had known her primarily in her role as family mentor and friend, but the ceremony was illuminating the broader scope of her life's work. The woman who had taught him about patience and kindness had apparently been applying those same virtues to improve lives across multiple continents. Catherine noticed how the natural light filtering through the Abbey's windows seemed to change throughout the ceremony, creating shifting patterns of shadow and illumination that added to the sense of transition and transformation. Lady Margaret had often spoken about finding meaning in life's changes, viewing each season as an opportunity for growth and deeper understanding of purpose. The children's choir returned for another selection, this time performing a piece that Lady Margaret had commissioned specifically for occasions when hope needed to triumph over sadness. Their voices soared through the ancient building, carrying with them the promise that love and memory could transcend physical loss. Several mourners were visibly moved by the performance, including Catherine, who felt tears gathering despite her efforts to maintain composure. As the formal tributes concluded and the ceremony moved toward its final elements, the family prepared themselves for the most emotionally challenging moments that lay ahead. The closing portions of the service would require them to say their final goodbyes while maintaining the strength and dignity that Lady Margaret had always embodied during her own encounters with loss and grief. The moment arrived for William to deliver his personal eulogy, a responsibility he had requested despite the emotional challenges it would present. Rising from his seat beside Catherine, he moved toward the pulpit with the measured steps of someone carrying both grief and determination. The Abbey fell into complete silence as the future king prepared to honor the woman who had helped shape his understanding of duty, compassion, and authentic leadership. Catherine watched her husband with a mixture of pride and concern, knowing how deeply Lady Margaret's death had affected him. During their private conversations over the past few days, William had struggled to find words that would adequately capture both his personal loss and the broader significance of Lady Margaret's life. She had been more than a mentor. She had been a bridge between his royal destiny and his human heart. Prince George looked up at his father with wide eyes, understanding that this moment was particularly important, even if he couldn't fully grasp its emotional complexity. William had explained to his son that sometimes grown-ups needed to speak about people they loved who had died, and that sharing happy memories could help make the sadness feel less overwhelming. William began his eulogy by acknowledging the diverse gathering of mourners, recognizing that Lady Margaret's influence had touched lives in ways that extended far beyond the royal family. His voice was steady but carried undertones of emotion that revealed the depth of his personal connection to the woman they were honoring. He spoke about her ability to make everyone feel valued, regardless of their status or background. The first story William shared brought gentle laughter from the congregation. He described Lady Margaret's reaction to his teenage attempts at rebellion, how she had managed to redirect his energy toward more constructive pursuits without ever making him feel criticized or misunderstood. Her approach had been to present alternatives rather than impose restrictions, a strategy that had earned his respect while achieving her goals of keeping him grounded. Catherine felt her own memories stirring as William continued his tribute. He mentioned Lady Margaret's role in helping Catherine adjust to royal life, specifically praising the older woman's ability to offer guidance without overwhelming criticism. Catherine remembered their long conversations about balancing authenticity with protocol, discussions that had proven invaluable during her most challenging early experiences as a public figure. The congregation listened intently as William described Lady Margaret's philosophy about royal service. She had believed that true leadership came from understanding and responding to people's genuine needs rather than simply fulfilling ceremonial obligations. Her charitable work had been guided by this principle, focusing on sustainable solutions rather than temporary gestures of goodwill. One particularly moving section of the eulogy focused on Lady Margaret's relationship with the royal children. William described how she had made each grandchild and great-grandchild feel special and heard, despite the demands on her time and attention. Her gift for connecting with young people had made her an invaluable resource for parents trying to raise children within the unique constraints of royal life. Catherine noticed how William's voice strengthened as he moved into discussing Lady Margaret's broader impact on British society. His research had revealed charitable initiatives and educational programs that had quietly transformed thousands of lives over the decades. The woman's preference for working behind the scenes had meant that many of her contributions were only now becoming fully known to the public. The international representatives in the congregation nodded in recognition as William mentioned Lady Margaret's diplomatic contributions. Her unofficial role in fostering relationships between Britain and other nations had been particularly significant during periods of political tension. Foreign dignitaries had often found her to be a valuable intermediary who could communicate difficult messages with grace and cultural sensitivity. William paused briefly, his composure wavering slightly as he prepared to address the more personal aspects of his relationship with Lady Margaret. Catherine could see him drawing on the inner strength that had carried him through other challenging public moments. Lady Margaret herself had taught him that showing genuine emotion was a sign of strength rather than weakness. The most poignant section of the eulogy focused on Lady Margaret's final months, when her declining health had not diminished her interest in the lives and welfare of others. William described hospital visits where she had been more concerned about the comfort of her visitors than her own medical treatment. Her grace in facing mortality had provided the family with a powerful example of how to approach life's final transition. Prince George listened carefully as his father explained how Lady Margaret had specifically asked that her funeral focus on gratitude rather than sadness. She had wanted people to remember the joy she had found in service and relationships rather than dwelling on the inevitability of loss. Her perspective had been shaped by decades of witnessing how love and purpose could triumph over adversity. Catherine felt tears beginning to flow as William shared Lady Margaret's final advice to the royal family. The elderly woman had encouraged them to continue evolving their approach to public service while never losing sight of the fundamental humanity that connected them to their subjects. Her vision for the monarchy's future had been both progressive and deeply rooted in traditional values. The conclusion of William's eulogy brought the entire congregation to their feet in spontaneous applause, an unusual occurrence during a funeral service, but entirely appropriate for celebrating Lady Margaret's remarkable life. The sustained ovation reflected genuine appreciation for both William's tribute and the woman they were honoring. Catherine could see that her husband was struggling to maintain his composure as the emotional impact of the moment intensified. As William returned to his seat, Catherine reached for his hand, providing the physical connection that had sustained them through countless public challenges. Their brief touch communicated volumes about their shared grief and mutual support. Lady Margaret had often remarked on the strength of their partnership, predicting that their united approach to royal duties would serve them well during difficult times. The ceremony moved toward its conclusion with a final hymn chosen specifically by Lady Margaret for its message of hope and continuity. The entire congregation joined in singing, their combined voices creating a powerful expression of community and shared purpose. The music seemed to carry everyone's individual grief into a collective celebration of a life that had touched so many others. During the closing prayers, Catherine reflected on how Lady Margaret's influence would continue to shape their family's approach to royal service. The lessons she had taught about compassion, authenticity, and quiet leadership would remain relevant long after this day of farewell. Her legacy lived not just in the charitable organizations she had supported, but in the hearts and minds of everyone she had touched with her wisdom and kindness. The procession from Westminster Abbey moved with solemn dignity through London's historic streets toward the private burial ground at Windsor Castle. Catherine sat quietly beside William in their car, both processing the emotional intensity of the ceremony while preparing for the more intimate farewell that awaited them. The public portion of Lady Margaret's send-off had honored her remarkable life, but the private burial would allow the family to express their grief more personally. Prince George had handled the Abbey service with remarkable maturity, but Catherine could see signs of fatigue in his young face. The complexity of adult emotions surrounding death and loss was challenging for anyone to navigate, particularly a child who was still developing his understanding of mortality and grief. William had made the decision that George would witness the burial, believing that completing the entire farewell process would provide closure rather than leaving unanswered questions. The route to Windsor took them past several of the charitable institutions that Lady Margaret had supported throughout her decades of service. Small groups of people had gathered outside these buildings, holding flowers and photographs in silent tribute to a woman whose impact on their lives had been profound. Catherine noted how many of the mourners were elderly, reflecting Lady Margaret's particular dedication to improving the lives of senior citizens who often felt forgotten by society. At St. George's Chapel within Windsor Castle, a much smaller gathering awaited the family's arrival. This group consisted of Lady Margaret's closest relatives, longtime palace staff who had worked with her directly, and a few personal friends whose relationships with her had spanned multiple decades. The intimate nature of this ceremony would allow for more personal expressions of grief and remembrance. The chapel itself held special significance for William and Catherine, as it was where they had celebrated numerous family occasions, and where their own children had been christened. Lady Margaret had been present for many of these joyful events, her consistent presence providing continuity and stability throughout the changing seasons of royal life. Today, the familiar surroundings offered comfort even as they marked a painful farewell. Catherine noticed how the afternoon light filtered through the chapel's stained glass windows, creating patterns of color that seemed to dance across the stone walls. Lady Margaret had often spoken about finding God's presence in beauty and light, viewing the natural world as a constant reminder of divine love and eternal hope. The interplay of shadow and illumination felt particularly meaningful on this day of transition. The burial service began with readings selected by Lady Margaret's own family members, passages that reflected her personal faith journey and her understanding of death as a transition rather than an ending. Her great-nephew, a young clergyman, delivered words about resurrection and eternal life with a conviction that suggested genuine belief rather than mere professional obligation. His composure provided strength to other family members who were struggling with their emotions. William found himself remembering the many conversations he had shared with Lady Margaret about the challenges of public service and the importance of maintaining perspective during difficult times. She had possessed an unusual ability to discuss serious topics while maintaining her characteristic warmth and gentle humor. Her guidance had been particularly valuable during his military service and his transition into full-time royal duties. Prince George stood close to his parents throughout the burial service, occasionally leaning against Catherine for comfort, while maintaining the respectful demeanor that had been carefully explained to him. The family had prepared him for this moment by discussing how saying goodbye could be both sad and beautiful, helping someone we love find peace while keeping their memory alive in our hearts. The lowering of Lady Margaret's casket into the earth marked the most emotionally challenging moment of the entire day. Catherine felt tears flowing freely for the first time, her careful composure finally giving way to the grief she had been managing throughout the public ceremonies. William's arm around her shoulders provided both physical and emotional support as they witnessed the final commitment of someone who had been central to their lives. Several palace staff members who had worked closely with Lady Margaret for decades were visibly overcome with emotion during this portion of the service. Their grief reflected not just professional respect but genuine affection for a woman who had treated everyone with dignity, regardless of their position or responsibilities. Her leadership style had been characterized by kindness and inclusion, rather than hierarchy and distance. The chaplain's final prayer spoke of Lady Margaret's soul finding rest in God's eternal love, while her example continued to inspire those who remained. Catherine found comfort in the traditional words that had provided solace to countless mourners throughout history. The rituals of farewell served important psychological functions, helping the living process loss while celebrating the continuation of love beyond physical presence. Following the burial, the family gathered in the private apartments at Windsor Castle for a reception that Lady Margaret had specifically requested in her final wishes. Rather than a somber gathering focused on loss, she had wanted a celebration that included sharing favorite memories and stories about her life. The atmosphere gradually shifted from grief toward gratitude as people began sharing anecdotes that revealed different aspects of her personality. Catherine listened as various guests recounted stories that illuminated Lady Margaret's impact on their lives. A former ambassador described her invaluable assistance during a particularly difficult diplomatic crisis. A charity worker shared how Lady Margaret's financial support had enabled a groundbreaking educational program. Each story added another dimension to the portrait of a woman whose influence had been both broad and deep. William contributed several stories that brought laughter from the gathered mourners, including Lady Margaret's reaction to modern technology and her determined efforts to understand social media despite her advanced age. Her curiosity about changing times and her willingness to adapt had kept her relevant and engaged even as the world transformed around her. Prince George became more animated during the reception, his natural curiosity emerging as he heard adults sharing happy memories about Lady Margaret. Catherine had explained that this type of remembering was one way that people kept loved ones alive in their hearts even after death. The concept was still developing in his young mind, but he seemed to understand that grief and joy could coexist. The afternoon progressed. Catherine found herself in conversation with Lady Margaret's personal secretary, a woman who had worked with her for over 30 years. Their discussion revealed the extent of Lady Margaret's private charitable work, including educational scholarships, medical research funding, and support for families in crisis. Much of this work had been conducted anonymously, reflecting her belief that helping others should be its own reward. The reception concluded with a toast proposed by Lady Margaret's eldest nephew, celebrating a life dedicated to service, love, and quiet leadership. The gathering raised their glasses in honor of a woman who had embodied the best qualities of her generation while preparing younger family members to carry forward her values and commitments. The sense of continuity provided comfort amid the sadness of farewell. The evening sky over Windsor Castle painted gentle shades of purple and gold as William, Catherine, and George returned to their private quarters after the long day of farewells. The emotional weight of the ceremonies had left them all feeling drained, yet somehow cleansed, as if the formal process of mourning had begun to transform their raw grief into something more manageable and meaningful. George had fallen asleep. In the car during their short journey from the castle's main buildings to their residence, his small body finally succumbing to the emotional and physical exhaustion of witnessing adult rituals of loss and remembrance. Catherine carried him gently to his bedroom, reflecting on how the day had provided him with his first real encounter with mortality and the complex emotions that surround death and remembrance. In the quiet of their private sitting room, William and Catherine finally allowed themselves to fully process the day's events without the need to maintain public composure or consider the feelings of other mourners. The silence between them was comfortable and healing, filled with shared memories and mutual understanding of what Lady Margaret had meant to their family and their approach to royal service. Catherine found herself thinking about the many conversations she had shared with Lady Margaret over the years, particularly those that had helped her navigate the challenges of adapting to royal life while maintaining her authentic self. The older woman's guidance had been invaluable during Catherine's early years as a duchess, when every public appearance felt overwhelming and fraught with potential for mistakes or misunderstandings. William moved to the window that overlooked the castle grounds where Lady Margaret had been laid to rest earlier that afternoon. The peaceful setting seemed appropriate for someone who had found such joy in gardens and natural beauty throughout her long life. He remembered how she had insisted on personally tending to certain flower beds well into her 80s, claiming that working with soil and plants kept her connected to the cycles of life and renewal. The condolence messages that had been pouring in throughout the day reflected the remarkable scope of Lady Margaret's influence on people from all walks of life. Foreign heads of state had sent personal notes remembering her diplomatic contributions, while ordinary citizens shared stories of chance encounters that had left lasting impressions. The volume and sincerity of these tributes revealed a woman whose impact had extended far beyond what even her family had fully understood. Catherine's phone displayed dozens of messages from friends and family members who wanted to offer support during this difficult time. Her parents had sent a particularly touching note about their own memories of Lady Margaret, including her kindness during their first formal royal events when they had felt uncertain about protocol and expectations. The Middleton family had grown genuinely fond of the elderly royal, appreciating her warmth and lack of pretension. As they prepared for bed, William and Catherine discussed how they would help their children process the day's events and Lady Margaret's death in the coming days and weeks. Child psychologists had advised that children needed ongoing opportunities to ask questions and express their feelings about loss, rather than treating death as a topic that should be avoided or quickly forgotten. The couple agreed that they would establish some family traditions to honor Lady Margaret's memory, perhaps including annual visits to her grave and continued support for the charitable causes that had been closest to her heart. They wanted their children to understand that remembering loved ones who had died was an ongoing process rather than something that ended with funeral ceremonies. Catherine reflected on how Lady Margaret's influence would continue to shape their approach to royal duties and public service. The woman's emphasis on authentic connection with people, rather than merely fulfilling ceremonial obligations, had become a cornerstone of William and Catherine's public philosophy. Her legacy would live on through their continued commitment to meaningful engagement with the communities they served. William discovered a handwritten letter on his desk that had been delivered earlier in the day, recognizable immediately as Lady Margaret's distinctive penmanship. She had apparently written final messages to various family members before her death, asking her secretary to deliver them after the funeral. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope that bore his name in her careful script. The letter was, "Vintage Lady Margaret, warm, wise, and focused on others even as she faced her own mortality." She thanked William for the joy he had brought to her life and expressed her confidence in his future as king. Most importantly, She reminded him that the greatest leaders were those who never forgot their fundamental humanity, even when carrying the weight of enormous responsibility. Catherine received her own letter, which brought fresh tears as she read Lady Margaret's encouragement about her role as a modern royal woman. The elderly woman had written about watching Catherine grow into her position with grace and authenticity, praising her ability to balance tradition with contemporary relevance. She had specifically mentioned how proud she was of Catherine's work with children and families. The letter to Prince George was shorter but equally meaningful, written in simpler language that he could understand as he grew older. Lady Margaret had told him stories about brave princes throughout history, encouraging him to be kind, curious, and compassionate as he prepared for his own future responsibilities. She had included a small pressed flower from her garden, something tangible he could keep as a reminder of their connection. As the family read their letters together, they felt Lady Margaret's presence in a way that was both comforting and profound. Her final words demonstrated the same thoughtfulness and care for others that had characterized her entire life. Even facing death, she had been thinking about how to provide encouragement and guidance to those she would leave behind. The letters also contained practical advice about specific challenges each family member might face in the years ahead. Lady Margaret's decades of experience had given her unique insights into the pressures and opportunities of royal life. Her counsel would prove invaluable as William and Catherine continued to evolve their approach to public service and family life. Later that evening, William and Catherine sat together in their private garden, finding peace in the quiet beauty of the night sky. The stars seemed particularly bright, prompting them to remember Lady Margaret's frequent observations about finding wonder in simple natural phenomena. She had possessed an unusual ability to discover meaning and beauty in everyday moments, a perspective that had enriched the lives of everyone around her. Their conversation turned to plans for honoring Lady Margaret's memory through continued support of her favorite causes. They discussed establishing an annual scholarship in her name and perhaps creating a foundation focused on the elderly care initiatives that had been particularly close to her heart. The goal was to ensure that her passion for helping others would continue to make a difference long after her death. Catherine mentioned several young people who had benefited from Lady Margaret's mentorship over the years, including staff members who had advanced their careers through her encouragement and support. The ripple effects of her kindness and guidance had touched countless lives in ways that would continue to unfold for generations to come. As they prepared to end this emotionally exhausting but meaningful day, William and Catherine felt a sense of gratitude mixed with their grief. Lady Margaret's death had been a significant loss, but the process of saying goodbye had reminded them of the profound impact one person could have through a lifetime of service, love, and quiet leadership. Her example would continue to inspire their own efforts to make a positive difference in the world. The day had also strengthened their appreciation for each other and for their family's ability to support one another through difficult times. Lady Margaret had often observed that the greatest treasures in life were the relationships we build and nurture, a truth that felt particularly relevant as they reflected on her remarkable legacy of love and service to others.